we are at the corner of Victoria and Russell Street in Melbourne at the 8-hour monument. I'm regaled in the 1850s attire of a gentleman. The definition of a gentleman is a person who doesn't need to work to earn a living, who lives off other people's sweat, blood and tears. Well, obviously I'm not a gentleman, but this is the 8-hour monument, which has something to do with May Day, the 1st of May. It was erected in 1903, although the 8-hour struggle was won in Melbourne by the Melbourne stonemasons on the 21st of April 1856, and we'll talk about that in a much quieter place. Why 1903? Because of a number of collections from Trades Hall went missing, and it wasn't until 1903 when Percival Ball, sculptor, sculpted this spectacular masterpiece that the monument to the 8-hour day was erected in Melbourne. Just in case you want to touch this beautiful monument, Melbourne workers and anarchists will be rallying here at midday on Wednesday the 1st of May to honour the 8-hour struggle and to honour May Day on the 1st of May. Not the first Sunday after the 1st of May, but the 1st of May. We'll be walking from here down to Her Majesty's Theatre, which was the home of the first anarchist organisation in the city, the Melbourne Anarchist Club, which was formed on the 1st of May 1886. So you can actually see how the history of Melbourne anarchism and Australian anarchism is intertwined with Melbourne May Day. After that, at around 1 o'clock, we'll be walking at least maybe 22 metres across the road from Her Majesty's Theatre to the Paramount Food Hall for a May Day lunch. You buy your own food and drinks. Come and join us, celebrate the 1st of May. Here we are in the sun. In the sun. And let's not forget that Australia was colonised in 1788 by the British Empire. It wasn't colonised by free men and women who migrated here. The people who were brought here in chains. They were convicts. Most of them were deported for petty crimes. What had happened is, with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and the forced closures of the commons, the peasants were forced out of the agricultural sector into the cities to provide cheap labour for the capitalism which was growing at that particular point in time. We had children as young as 4 or 5 working and dying in mines for the glory of the Industrial Revolution. And the riffraff who were arrested were sent to Australia, some for heinous crimes, but most for economic crimes. You could be hung for stealing a loaf of bread or a handkerchief in England at the end of the 18th century. So the hulks were prison ships in the Thames full of people rotting and dying from the most petty crimes. So what did the British authorities do discovering the east coast of Australia? Not only did they dispossess the original inhabitants, they brought across these men and women to provide a cheap source of labour for the British Empire as it went about its program of destroying indigenous civilisations for the glory of Queen Victoria. Well, not in those days, the glory of King George. So in 1788 they turned up with about 1,400 convicts, and these convicts were basically free labour. In 1791, 3 years after the original colonisation began at Sydney Harbour, the convicts gathered in a tumultuous melee demanding their rations to be paid weekly, not monthly. This could be considered to be the first strike in the history of the new Australian colony, the British colony in Australia. In 1822, a man whose name has not been recorded in the annals of history, James Straiter, S-T-R-A-I-T-R, a man who has never received his just deserts in the history of this country, was a convict who was free labour for Hannibal MacArthur, the great MacArthur that you've all read about in your history books, who was the father of the Merino sheep. Not technically, biologically, but the fact he stole it from the Spanish to bring it to Australia. So, Mr. MacArthur, the richest man in Australia in 1822, was faced with a dilemma. James Straiter, a man who had a little bit of backbone, a convict, was sentenced to 500 lashes of the cat o' nine tails, 1 month in prison on bread and water to survive the torture, and to spend the rest of his prison sentence in a penal colony for having the audacity to organise the first strike in Australia in 1822. During the lambing season, when the sheep are producing lambs, Mr. Straiter attempted to organise his fellow convicts to use their collective bargaining power to improve their social situation. He was charged with the heinous crime of inciting, that's right, inciting his fellow convicts to pressure their master to increase their wages and rations. And for that heinous crime, he received 500 lashes, which would kill most men. He received 1 month in jail, solitary confinement on bread and water, and then spent the rest of his life rotting in jail. This is the history of the leader of the first strike in this country. Remember that name, James Straiter. In 1824, the Coopers, not the Cooper family, but the Coopers, these are the men and women who are involved in making barrels, went on strike to improve their conditions. In 1829, the members, the employees of Wentworth, who ran the newspaper The Australian, not Murdoch as today, but Wentworth, one of the richest men in New South Wales, went on strike for improved wages. So what we had is this bubbling along of this situation in Australia where you had convicts coming into the country, being brought in against their will, and 3 settlers coming into the country. So you had this competition between convicts whose labour was 3, which the squatters wanted, and 3 men, as well as the more radical convicts who demanded a just return for their labour. Over the next 50 years, we saw the rise of a workers' movement which was involved in that struggle to improve wages and conditions. And that struggle was given a kick along by the Eureka Rebellion in 1854, when everything was up for grabs, when the government collapsed, when people got universal male suffrage, when the way to access land had changed. So in 1856, on the 21st of April, the Melbourne stonemasons, who were critical to the building boom which was occurring in Melbourne in the 1850s, walked off the job at Melbourne University and went across all the other building sites, including Parliament House, and pulled their workers off the building sites. And they won the 8-hour day. Now, people in Victoria will tell you they were the first to win the 8-hour day of the world. They weren't. The stonemasons in New South Wales had won that right in 1855, the previous year. Now, that monument that we were standing at before, the 8-hour monument, was created to remember that struggle. And on the top of the monument, you'll see the 3 8s. 888 is not a mistake. It's not 666 with a little round top. It's 888. And that was the slogan which the working class movement used for the next 40 years, not just in Australia, but around the world. 8 hours work, 8 hours rest, 8 hours play. Now, the first organised Labor Day commemoration occurred in 1871 in Sydney. And the Sydney bricklayers, stonemasons, carpenters and labourers set aside
to remember that 8-hour struggle. Now, the 8-hour struggle is usually remembered in March, but things were happening in the rest of the world. And in 1884, the Federated Unions of the United States and Canada call for universal international demonstrations to struggle for the 8-hour day. Because although some of the more skilled workers had the 8-hour day, most workers didn't have the 8-hour day. And they called for that at their conference in 1884. On the 1st of May, 1886, there were demonstrations, mainly in the United States of America and Canada, in Chicago, which was involved in a bitter strike at the Harvester Combine factory. In Chicago, over 30,000 people went on strike and 80,000 people marched in that demonstration. On the 3rd of May, 2 days later, the authorities, fearing an outbreak of a bit of worker radicalism, shot dead 4 workers outside the Harvester Combine factory, Mackay Harvester Combine factory in Chicago. That's on the next day, the 4th of May 1886, Chicago anarchists organised a demonstration at the Haymarket Square. And at the end of the demonstration, when there's only about 200 people left, the police charged the demonstrators. A bomb was thrown at the police. 1 policeman was died. The police panicked. They shot into the crowd and among themselves. And at the end of the mayhem, 7 police lay dead, 4 demonstrators lay dead, and there were hundreds of people who'd been injured in the melee. And the only people who had guns were the police. Somebody had to be blamed for the mayhem and the murder. 8 Chicago anarchists were tried for conspiracy to murder. They were found guilty. 4 Parsons, Spies, Fisher and Engel were hanged on the 11th. On the 11th of November, that famous day again, the 11th of November 1887. Ling, who was also sentenced to hang on that day, committed suicide the night before. Fielden and Schwab were sentenced to life imprisonment, and Neebe to 15 years. Surprise, surprise, 20 years later, all 8 men, even those who were hung, received pardons because they had nothing to do with the mayhem that had occurred. So the Haymarket Square tragedy, or massacre, has become a central feature of the May Day. Now, on the 1st of May 1886, 2 brothers, David and William Andre, in Melbourne, formed the Melbourne Anarchist Club, the first anarchist organisation formed in Australia, heeding the call of the Federated Unions of the United States and Canada to make the 1st of May a day of international protests. The first May Day, which occurred in Australia, was on the 1st of May 1891, when over 1,000 shearers, 600 on horseback, flying the Eureka flag, marched in Balcaldine in Queensland at the height of the great shearers' strike, which shook this nation to its knees. On the 1st of May 1892, Chubby Fleming, the well-known Melbourne anarchist who Chummy Lane in Carlton is named after, organised the first May Day march in Melbourne at the Yarra Bank, from the Burke and Wills Memorial to the Yarra Bank. In 1893, a committee was set up to organise May Day marches. There's always been tension between Labor Day and May Day. In Victoria, there is no holiday on May Day. In Queensland, there is a public holiday on the 1st of May because the agricultural workers in Queensland are a bit more radical than the workers here in Victoria. So on the 1st of May this year, there'll be a few dozen anarchists and their supporters will be congregating on the steps of the 8-hour monuments to mark that day, the 1st of May, the day of international protest to improve workers' lots, irrespective of their sex, their sexual orientation, their race, their colour, their nationality. the movement for an 8-hour day was an international movement. Even in the 1890s, if you came to Melbourne or any other city, there'd be tens of thousands of workers out on the streets in March celebrating that 8-hour struggle. In the 1950s, Henry Bolte, the Premier of Victoria, changed the march into a little festival called the Moomba. And when that festival was called, an Indigenous activist, an Indigenous man who was working at Trades Hall, they thought it'd be nice to ask this gentleman what we should call this new festival. Him being an active trade unionist as well as an Indigenous activist said Moomba, which in the local dialect means up your bum. And since then, the people of Victoria and Melbourne have been celebrating the Up Your Bum festival since the 1950s. But it did destroy the 8-hour struggle. Now, people think, what's this got to do with us in 2019? Think about it. Casualisation, no penalty rates, $6 an hour, migrant workers being exploited, local workers being exploited, young people have been exploited, people working more than 8 hours per day. If you ask people, you work more than 8 hours per day, you'll find that many Australians are forced to work 9, 10, 11 hours a day. And some of those hours aren't paid. It's just part of the job. So that struggle for the 8-hour day is as relevant today as it was in 1856, as it was in 1791, as it was in 1822 when James Straiter organised the first strike in this country and paid the penalty for that strike. This year in Victoria, May Day will be celebrated with the trade union movement, as it usually is on the first Sunday after the 1st of May, and that will be here at the Victorian Trades Hall, and obviously we encourage people to attend. But if you want to celebrate May Day on the day it should be celebrated, the 1st of May, well then join us at the 8 Hours Monument this Wednesday at midday, hear a few speeches, then walk with us to Her Majesty's Theatre. No, we're not going to watch some great play or some bad play. Majesty's Theatre was the actual office of the first anarchist organisation, the Melbourne Anarchist Club, which was formed by David and William Andre on the 1st of May 1886. Now, anarchists are intrinsically intertwined with the history of May Day in Australia. Not only did they create the first anarchist organisation on the 1st of May, they celebrated May Day in 1887, 1888 and in 1889. In 1890 and 91, there were May Day celebrations occurred in the office of Dr Maloney, who became the member for Melbourne, the federal member for Melbourne a few years later, and then Chubby Fleming organised the first May Day march in 1892. Chubby Fleming took part in every May Day march until he died in 1950, and in 1951 his ashes were scattered on the Yarra Bank. There's a funny story about Chubby Fleming. Now, Chubby stated, he lived just around the corner in Carlton, in All Street. He stated he wanted his ashes scattered at May Day after his death. Now, as May Day approached, nobody could find his ashes. So a call went out to the Butchers Union, who brought across a big box of ashes, I assume of some animals that had been cremated, and the wind was blowing, the ashes were thrown into the wind, the ashes came back and went up the nostrils and the ears and the mouths of the assembled people celebrating May Day, a fitting end. So that won't happen this year. We've got no ashes to scatter, but come along, join us, 1st of May, Wednesday, midday, 8 Hour Monument. If you're more of a traditionalist, come along and join the Trades Hall March at midday on the 5th of May. Next week, who knows what we're going to talk about? I don't know, but something I am interested in is I'm going to do some more research with James Straiter, because I think this man should be remembered. He should be plucked from obscurity, and the sacrifice he made for trying to get some of the richest landowners in this country to fairly pay their workers and improve their rations in 1822, and the fate he suffered and the sacrifice he made should be etched in stone. Hannibal MacArthur, who we all remember was a pig and an animal, and my apologies to animals. Hannibal MacArthur was not a nice man. Straiter was interested in looking after the welfare of the people around. Thank you.